Well, we've gone over the role of managers in this podcast at kind of different times, talking about what they do and what they contribute to the team. And so it was kind of interesting this year where we saw Bruce Bochy take a Ranger squad that just 2 years ago lost 100 games. Now, obviously, there's been a significant amount of roster turnover since then. But here comes in Bruce Bochy this year, and he's able to lead them to the World Series this year. And he's getting a lot of credit for that as being a big reason why they got that title.
And I think almost the team was not far from not making the playoffs at all. If you remember, at the very end of the season. So it's a big change.
I mean, a game or two goes differently in the regular season. They don't make the playoffs at all instead of winning it all. So, I mean, it's interesting how just that slightest bit of margins and just getting to the postseason gave them this chance for them to have this World Series title.
And you mentioned it hasn't happened very much, so there's a few different categories, right? So Bochy had managed before, he even won a World Series before, and so if you're winning a World Series in your first year with the team, but you had managed before, there's only 3 other guys as managers that did that, and one of them is Bucky Harris, who we talked about in our Washington Senators podcast, and he managed the Yankees to a World Series in 1947. Bob Lemon, so they fired Billy Martin in the middle of the season in 1978, and the Yankees ended up winning the World Series. That's the third guy. And then Lou Piniella came in with the Reds in his first year.
Oh, okay, so he had managed before he was with the Reds.
He had managed before he managed the Reds, correct.
Okay.
And so, but that's the only guys that ever, won a World Series, having gone someplace at all, and came in there. So you think about this year, right? So anybody moving? So Bruce Bochy came in obviously into that. Is there anybody who's won a World Series that's moved over? No, I guess we don't have any candidates there, but we have a lot of first-year managers coming up this year.
We do.
And so does that change the mojo? Can you possibly, come in and all of a sudden take a team that was right there and all of a sudden, because you're there like Bruce Bochy was.
Well, I think more so it's less that it's you and it's just that you're not somebody else. I think you saw that last year with the Phillies and getting rid of who was their manager?
Joe Girardi.
Joe Girardi, getting rid of Girardi and bringing in Rob Thompson. Whatever the vibe Girardi had in that clubhouse did not work for them, and Thompson promotes a better one. I think that's a large part of the reason why the Mets moved on from Showalter, is that the clubhouse culture and vibe that Showalter had established wasn't working. And so the easiest way to change that is to change the guy at the top that sets it all.
And in Buck Showalter's case, and we talked about this a little bit, usually it takes Buck, like he always has a good first year wherever he goes.
And he's like a middling second year and a bad third year. And
so it usually takes 3 or 4 years for the cycle to go through before he gets fired.
I think everybody getting hurt this year just sort of sped it up.
And it felt kind of bad that he got fired because it wasn't anything in particular that Met fans saw him do or not do.
It was just you had too good a team to be that bad.
Right.
And you're going to take the fall as the manager because he can't fire the players.
So he's looking for a job someplace. He won't get the Angels job because Ron Washington
took that. And, Ron Washington takes that job probably not going to get it. He's going to be there while they're terrible.
Yeah.
Because they're going to probably get...
Talk about taking one for the team.
Well, yeah, because Ohtani's going to go sign elsewhere because I think everybody expects he's not
Trout's going to be traded, I think.
Yeah, we think that Trout's going to get traded and that team's going to have nothing. But you bring in Juan Washington to teach this what's going to be a young, inexperienced team how to navigate a full season of professional baseball. And I think that's a big part of what the managers do now is you're less responsible for whatever strategy you're using. Because let's be honest, the amount that the manager is contributing to the overall baseball strategy of this team is much, much less compared to what an NBA coach or an NFL coach is contributing.
I 100% agree with that.
Or even an NHL coach.
The on-the-field stuff, where the manager does it, we talked about this. Maybe your bullpen usage late in games.
Right, but even then, depending on the team you're on, you might not even have any say about that. You're just following what the computer spits out at you to do.
So I think there are only 5 rookie managers.
I know 2 of them
that have won the World Series. So we have rookie managers this year. One of them is at least here in New York, and Carlos Mendoza.
You're going to see that. But yeah, it was Cora and Brenly.
Right.
Both got a World Series win in their first year as a manager.
And Brenly always blew my mind because he literally came out of the team. Now, he was a major league player, major league catcher, a decent player, but came out of the broadcast booth where he was somewhat outspoken, and then all of a sudden he goes and replaces Buck Showalter, and the D-backs won the 2001 World Series with him at the helm. I don't think he ever did very much after that.
They got a World Series, though.
Ralph Houck comes in 1961 for the Yankees, and I thought, well, okay, right, because in 1960 the Yankees outscored the Pittsburgh Pirates 55-27 in the World Series
And
lost 4-3. So obviously, we have to get rid of this manager. We can't be losing to the Pirates. And
you can't lose a series like that.
And Ralph Howe comes in and manages the 61 Yankees, which is one of the great teams of all time.
Right, but that was just a team that was like he didn't really have to do a whole lot.
No, you write Maris, you write Mantle, you write Maris, you write Mantle, and you go.
And you're good.
And Bob Turley. Eddie Dyer, so he managed the Cardinals in 1946. I don't remember who they fired in 1945. They lost the World Series in 45 to the Detroit Tigers. So that was unacceptable because they had won in 42 and 44. It's like the Cardinals win World Series, we lose, we have to be fired now.
Corrected, yes. Mistake.
So not a guy I'm familiar with. And Bucky Harris managed the Senators in 1924, and that was his first year as manager. He was a player manager, for the team at that time. So there are a lot of player managers when you go back in history.
Right, most of them aren't great.
Tris Speaker, probably one of the best for the 1920 Cleveland Indians, and Rogers Hornsby, and he was an older guy by the time he started doing that kind of stuff. So.
Usually you were doing that because you were already kind of washed.
Yeah. Pete Rose did it. Frank Robinson did it.
There weren't a lot of guys that were player managing when they were at the top of their career.
And so we both agree, right, that there's no player manager opportunities. I mean, I couldn't even think of anybody.
You wouldn't do it. You wouldn't ask a player to do that nowadays.
I know. I have a great guy to be player manager.
Oh, who?
Shohei.
Yeah, funny.
Well, he does everything else. He pitches, he hits. He should be the manager too.
Yeah, funny guy.
I'm batting cleanup today. No. I think that there's only Speaker was the only guy to win a World Series as a player manager.
Right, and I just think it's the kind of thing where you're just not going to see it anymore. So it's kind of like one of those things that happens from like the before time in baseball. Like, oh yeah, some guys just used tree branches they plucked off of trees on the way to the stadium.
And it was a money-saving thing, I think, in a lot of ways, because you could bump the guy's salary, a Tris Speaker, whatever he was being paid in 1920 as a player, going, oh, you want to manage the team? We'll give you an extra $20, and you can be the manager, too.
Right, it would just cost him less than paying whatever the manager was going to cost him.
And so I think about that when I relate it to today, and when Council getting $8 million annually, $40 million for 5 years to manage the Cubs, right? The highest paid manager in the history of Major League Baseball, and they offered more than anybody else. And so I'm thinking, well, if you really think the manager's that impactful and that good, it's such a small price to pay rather than paying some pitcher $30 million.
You're paying like what is like a mid-tier bullpen arm for the best manager in baseball. It's an easy investment if you think about it that way.
Last I checked, right? Doesn't count against the salary cap.
No.
So I think if you want a manager, I don't see why you wouldn't do what the Cubs did and go out and pay the guy or overpay the guy and set. I'm not sure what not paying him accomplished, unless you just didn't want the guy or he didn't want to be there, like Craig Counsell didn't want to be.
Right, exactly. I think the thing is less that just the Cubs came and offered him a sum of money, and he was like, well, I'm going to not get that from the Brewers because the Brewers just don't spend like that. The Brewers were never going to give him $8 million. They barely play their own players $8 million a year. They're not going to pay the manager that.
And so when you think about, and we just heard today that it's here on Sunday that Joe Espada is going to be, he was the bench coach for the Astros, is going to be the new manager of the Astros. So he's a first-year manager with a team that arguably should compete at the very least to go back to the playoffs and the World Series. So there's a guy that could really step up in his first year.
But that's also a kind of guy that could have a terrible first year because a bunch of guys get hurt.
Oh, well, that can happen.
Right. So it's just like it's a lot of those times where you get these guys on their rookie year winning a World Series and they're taking over for a good team. It might just have been, well, the year before everybody got hurt, and then the new guy comes in, they all get healthy and play well. So I think that sometimes when you're a rookie manager with a really good team, you're just mostly there to not get in the way.
Right, with rookie manager for sure.
Right, like I'm thinking Joe Espada, he just needs to not get in the way in Houston.
And and the Mets tried this rookie manager thing with Luis Rojas a couple of years ago. That didn't go very well.
It didn't go well.
And they were supposed to be a pretty good team at the time too.
So now you're going to try with a new guy.
But if you think about all the teams that were either hired new managers or are looking for managers, it struck me that there's a lot of good teams. Angels notwithstanding. The Giants, I mean, that's a good team. They got a new manager.
Right.
Cleveland, That was a playoff team. Obviously, Francona retires. Now they've got Stephen Vogt. They've got a new manager, first-year manager with a good team. Are the Indians? Are the I'm going to keep doing that.
The Guardians.
The Guardians. A Central Division.
They would like to think of themselves,
right?
as.
I think they have a chance to win the Central Division. The Mets, obviously, they think that they have a chance.
The Padres, because the Giants stole their manager.
Exactly. The Astros just
the
filled
Brewers.
The Brewers. So it's really interesting how you have all these opportunities for first-year managers to have their team go not only to the playoffs, but if you look at Bruce Bochy,
that's
all the way.
I think that's also another thing that's part of the reason why you see more and more first-time managers having a shot is teams get rid of managers faster than they ever have before. So you're naturally going to have more and more first-time managers as teams are also less and less willing to try out retread guys. You're not seeing these guys bounce around from job to job like you kind of used to see these career managers that would somehow end up managing for 6 or 7 different teams over their career.
Yeah, or like in Connie Mack's case, managing the same team for 53 years.
Right, that doesn't happen as much either. You have guys managing for these teams, more teams for less time overall, which is going to lead to an increase in first-time managers.
And you're right. I think, if you had a reputation as a back then, if you go back to, I'm thinking of Dick Williams and with the A's in 72 and 73, they won 3 straight World Series, and he won 3 pennants with 3 clubs. That's pretty unusual, and that has to speak something to the manager, or is he always getting good teams?
I think it speaks something to the manager because getting pennants wasn't easy. You had to win your league, your league. So that's not easy,
right? You at least in 1972 he had to not only win the league, he had to win the division series at ALCS.
Right. So that was an impressive piece of work from him to do that with 3 different teams. I think you would say, okay, he's a good guy that's clearly getting the most out of his ball clubs. Maybe he's lucky because he avoided injuries in those years, but a manager has no influence over that. He can only play the guys he's got. And if he was able to guide his guys to 3 straight championships, you have to give him credit for that.
And he came up before that. He managed the Red Sox, so that's before divisional play, and they went to the World Series and lost in 1967. That was a tough one. The Cardinals beat them. And the Red Sox obviously were still on their for the century since 1918 thing.
I just think it's just what your role as a manager has changed. You're there to keep the guys aligned, get the young guys to understand what it means to be a ball player day in and day out, and get the vibe good. You don't need to be the rule and law guy because you don't need to do that. The world does it for you.
Well, you made a really good point, I think, on like Ron Washington, because he's there to teach. Right. So that's a different role than a team that's supposed to stop.
Carlos Mendoza is there to make sure that all of those guys are unified and pushing forward together.
Making sure that McNeil and Lindor don't have fights over raccoons or whatever it was.
That the vibe in the clubhouse is good, that guys are focused and working and not divided for whatever reason.
And he speaks Spanish, very well, obviously. And he was the Yankee bench coach. I think it's ever more important that, having a guy who doesn't speak Spanish when you have teams that have lots of Spanish speaking, how do you really get the inside vibe there if you don't hear it yourself?
You have to be really reliant on your players then, and it's not a good thing. And I think that's just kind of like the difference now. A lot of times managers are more like almost like the therapists for these guys. They have to be there to help them through their struggles during the season. Whereas before, it's like your manager was there to make sure that your guys didn't do anything stupid when you were on the road. Because, everybody wasn't walking around with mini video cameras in their pocket. If a player goes out when he's on the town, when he goes to LA and does something stupid, there's pictures and there's videos of it on the front page and on YouTube the next morning. Back in the day, that didn't happen, so you had to be a lot more on top of your guys to make sure that they weren't running around getting smashed between games each night.
You had bed checks.
Right, you had to do bed checks. You don't have to do that anymore.
No, you don't do that.
Not nearly to the same degree.
Do you remember when we were at the event last week with Ron Darling talking, and so Kelly and Troop said, the airplane thing with the Mets, and Ron wanted nothing to do with that.
He didn't want to talk about that.
So the Mets were
legendarily
destroyed a 747 or a 737
on the way back from Houston.
Like literally, it was like ridiculous amounts of damage that they had to pay, on this plane. They never denied it.
No,
they never said it didn't,
and
they just don't really want to talk about it. So the manager doesn't have to mess with stuff like that anymore either.
You don't have to deal with that as more because also the players coming up have been in these almost professional type systems since they've been little kids for the most part. They know what it is like to play baseball as a year-round profession. So because of that, they're not going to be nearly as wild. Bryce Harper's intensity and desire to win is seen as being a wild shot. You don't have guys like the 86 Mets where they're just ripping lines in the dugout during games.
Here's the thought I just had. So when you think about older managers, Ron Washington, 71, going to be managing potentially 21-year-olds, for the Angels. Do you think that the age gap, if a 70-year-old guy was to manage a team 50 or more years ago, is greater today between the 70-year-old and the 20-year-old, or less, or the same?
I think in some ways the difference is important, and I think that's kind of what they're going for. I don't think you really care as much about Ron Washington's ability to relate to the kids as much as you care about his ability to be like, no, look, I don't care. We're here to play baseball, and I'm here to help you learn how to be a baseball player. And he doesn't need to relate to them, and him being almost more aloof than that is probably helpful, because I think people don't. It's hard to get up and play 162 games. I don't think it's easy to think about playing a game every day for 21 straight days, and you're going to different towns during that, and you're flying all over the place, and you're exhausted, and you have to wake up, you have to play another game today, and you just really don't want to play a game, and you got to play another one. It can weigh on you, and that's where having an experienced manager like Ron Washington can be really helpful, rather than having a guy that's managing and learning what it's like to be a manager going through that for the first time.
I so agree with that. And Ron Washington, who did an excellent job with the 2010 and 2011 Rangers, they didn't win the World Series.
Right.
So he sort of gets hung with that a little bit.
And so if you're Ron Washington thinking, I might not be here when they're good, 5-6 years from now, but if I do my job really well, maybe we get there while I'm still there.
Right, and listen, if
you turn them into a playoff team in 3 or 4 seasons, you might get to reap the rewards of that a little bit.
And 5 years from now, when he's 76, he could run for president, because that just seems the thing you do. Once you get into your late 70s, now you don't become a baseball manager anymore; you run for president. So I think the teaching aspect is so different for a situation like that. There aren't many. So Buck Showalter isn't going to walk into a teaching situation.
Right.
Dusty Baker took the job because no one else would.
Right. You needed those guys to steady the franchises. You needed those guys to provide the stability and understand and handle the media day in and day out. You don't need these guys to teach these kids how to play ball. They know how to do that.
And being a first-time manager, it's interesting because you've been through plenty of seasons, so it's not like all these first-year guys like Mendoza.
Right, but you've never been the manager.
Been the guy, and some guys handle it better than other guys.
You never had to answer to the press every single day. Carlos Mendoza, maybe the press talks to him every day as the bench coach for the Yankees, but they use a quote from him once every 3 weeks, if that. Now, every single day, everything you say is the back page article of the New York Post. Now, every single day, it's Francisco Lindor coming into your office talking to you about why the team hasn't been, I'm not happy with how things are going. What are you going to do to fix this? You don't have to be the guy that Buck sends to go calm him down. You have to be the guy that figures out who's going to go do that for you.
And the first-year manager, Stephen Vogt, who's been known to be very, funny guy and a very, guy comes a quick wit and all that. I think that would be a nice change for that organization to have somebody there like that, because Terry Francona did things his own way. He was a great manager for them.
Right, that's going to be a hard thing.
It's replacing him, but because they're both kind of interesting guys with bright wit. But if you have a new guy who was a catcher, and I always like catchers as managers because I feel they see the field differently.
Very cerebral.
They've seen the field differently than everybody else from their perspective. Being behind the plate. So I think it won't be any of that. It's when a guy comes maybe from AAA and hasn't been, and that really doesn't happen so much anymore, where you bring a guy in from the minor leagues to the major league level.
A lot of the times I think that's because you want the guy that you're bringing in as manager to have some familiarity with the players that he's going to be managing the next season.
With those on the team itself?
Potentially. Or at least you want him to have been up at the major league level recently, because to bring a guy straight from AAA up to the majors when he's never been there, he's never seen what it's like. I think that's why you're not worried about Cabrera, because he's traveled with the Yankees for full seasons as the bench coach. He's been there day in, day out. He's watched the major league manager doing his job. It's like if you're going from the minor league to the major league, all of a sudden you're playing a lot more games. That was one of the things Ron Darling talked about in that thing we went to, is that when you're in the minor leagues, a lot of times you're playing 3 games and you have an off day. then you play 3 more games, then you have an off day. You don't have that in baseball.
That's a really good, interesting point
I
he
think
made.
that would affect the manager just as much because getting your guys through that is something you have to be able to manage them to do. And if you've never experienced that yourself, you're having no idea how to navigate that because you're going to be learning it too.
Yeah, Darling was saying basically, so go on the road, like you said, for 21 days and play in 4 different cities and not be home for 3 weeks. That's how you train minor leaguers for what it's like in the major leagues. Don't have them go someplace for 2 nights and they get, they take a couple of days off and they play a weekend series someplace else. That's not what the major leagues is like at all.
Exactly. And I think that yes, you're taking the planes everywhere, but if you're taking a plane, getting a bad night of sleep, then playing a game the next day, getting a bad night of sleep, playing the game the next day, and then you're flying off somewhere else, that's rough.
Do you think Craig Counsell, first-year manager with the Cubs, they have a chance because he's there now? Is their chance improved enough with him just being there?
I think if you're going to say that they have a chance to be they were almost a playoff team this year. They're probably going to be a playoff team next year, especially if they go out as they're rumored to be the favorites for Ohtani. You make moves like that, you make the playoffs, you got a chance.
Yeah, I don't think there's enough pitching there right now for them.
If you go and get Ohtani, that changes.
He won't be pitching next year, though.
That is true.
So I think so. It won't be a first year, is what I'm saying. So yeah, I think they can have an impact on it, but I think the manager's impact is more, like you said, on the psychological aspect of where the team's
the direction
going.
and mood of the team more than anything else. That's what you really is.
Yeah, if you got a good team, don't mess it up.